If the person who defended you most in life didn't share your last name, would they still be family? Today, you'll see a stepmother lose control, a father arrive at the wrong moment, and a maid named Lucy do the unthinkable, confront power to protect an invisible boy. But this act isn't just isolated courage. It's the tip of a secret kept since Ethan's birth, a secret that rewrites who's in charge, who loves, and who truly belongs in this house. Watch until the end, because when the truth comes out at the dinner table, no one will leave the same. The crystal chandelier in the grand foyer of the Esperanza Manor, now Hopewood Estate, trembled almost imperceptibly as Mrs. Lucy tightened her fists beside the tea tray. There, in the main hall of the mansion, under hundreds of crystals reflecting the golden afternoon light, she witnessed yet another scene that made her heart ache. Ethan, a mere 17 years old, stood with his head bowed before the white marble staircase, his hands trembling, clutching a literature book that had fallen to the floor. His ears were red with embarrassment, and he bit his lower lip, as he always did when trying to hold back tears. "You are a disappointment, Victoria," his stepmother. Shrill voice echoed through the luxurious space. "Your father works day and night to maintain all this, and you can't even have the decency to greet me properly." What had happened was simple. Ethan had come down the stairs engrossed in his reading and, upon seeing Victoria, had merely offered a shy wave and a quiet "hi" before heading towards the garden, nothing more than the natural behavior of a reserved young man. But Victoria turned it into an excuse for public humiliation. "And look at me when I'm speaking," she shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the boy's face. "Do you think you can ignore me just because I'm your stepmother? I am the lady of this house." It was then that Mrs. Lucy did something she had never done in her 15 years working for that family. The tea tray almost slipped from her hands as she took 3 determined steps and positioned herself beside Ethan. Her voice, normally soft and respectful, was firm and clear. "Excuse me, Mrs. Victoria, but Ethan was just engrossed in his book. He has always been polite. You know that." The silence that followed was deafening. The chandelier seemed to stop gleaming for an instant. Why would a housekeeper, a simple 52-year-old woman, risk her stability to defend a young man who technically wasn't even her family? What was it about that connection that she considered more important than her own job? And more importantly, what Ethan was about to discover about Mrs. Lucy would change not only his life, but the entire dynamic of that mansion forever. If this story has already piqued your curiosity and you want to follow what happens next, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss out. We have a new video every day here. Ethan Montgomery was the kind of young man who went unnoticed, even living in one of the most imposing mansions in Beverly Hills. Tall, thin, with perpetually messy brown hair and discreet framed glasses, he had a habit of walking through the house's corridors as if he were a ghost. The Hopewood Estate, with its 3 floors, 22 rooms, and gardens spanning almost 5 acres, should have been any teenager's paradise. But for Ethan, it was more a gilded cage. In the house's library, with its mahogany shelves from floor to ceiling, hundreds of classic books remained untouched. Ethan had read almost all of them, but always alone, always in silence. The German grand piano that occupied half of the living room was rarely played, only when important guests were visiting and his father, Richard Montgomery, wanted to impress them with his son's talent. Ethan had learned piano at 6, not out of passion, but because it was what was expected of a Montgomery. He played Chopin and Bach with technical perfection, but without soul, like everything else in his life. His routine was predictable. He woke at 6:30 a.m., had breakfast alone in the kitchen. Victoria rarely rose before 10 a.m., studied until noon, ate lunch in silence, spent afternoons reading in the garden or his room, dined with his father and Victoria when they were home, and went to bed early. The mansion's gardens, though beautiful with their imported roses, marble fountains, and ornate gazebos, were silent witnesses to the young man's loneliness. He often sat on the stone bench near the old oak tree, the only tree left from the original property, and watched the birds. It was there that he felt most at peace. Ethan had no close friends. His private school classmates viewed him as the Montgomery's son, creating an invisible barrier. Some envied him for his wealth, others thought him snobbish. He learned early that it was easier to be invisible. The boy's emotional need was something anyone observant could perceive. His brown eyes, which should have sparkled with youthful energy, held a premature melancholy. He smiled little, and when he did, it was always a polite smile, never genuine. And then there was Mrs. Lucy. Lucy Maria Santos was 52 years old, with grey hair always pulled back in a simple bun, and hands calloused from a lifetime of work. She always wore the same light blue cotton apron, faded from countless washes, and carried a small wooden rosary in her pocket that had belonged to her mother. Unlike the other staff members in the house, who treated Ethan with the respectful distance expected between employees and employers, Mrs. Lucy always had a special way with him. She wasn't intrusive, nor did she disrespect the house's hierarchies, but there was something in her gaze when she watched the young man, a mixture of affection and concern that went beyond professionalism. She always arrived at 5 a.m., an hour before her official start time. The first thing she did was prepare Ethan's breakfast exactly as he liked it: toasted sourdough bread, homemade strawberry jam, fresh orange juice, and a warm glass of milk. Small gestures that made a difference in the boy's empty routine. When Ethan fell ill, it was Mrs. Lucy who kept an eye on him, discreetly asking if he was eating well, if he needed anything. When he spent too many hours alone in his room, she would invent some excuse to go there, to bring clean clothes, to check if the windows were closed, always with a maternal smile that warmed the young man's heart. Richard Montgomery, Ethan's father, was a 58-year-old man who had built a tech empire in Silicon Valley. Tall, elegant, always impeccably dressed, he loved his son in his own way, but was so absorbed in business that he rarely managed to show that love effectively. Conversations between father and son usually revolved around school grades, university plans, and expectations about Ethan taking over the family business in the future. Richard genuinely believed he was preparing his son for life, but didn't realize he was actually creating an ever-growing distance between them. And then there was Victoria. Victoria Montgomery, born Victoria Smith, was Richard's second wife. At 42, she was a beautiful woman, always impeccably made up, with eternally coiffed blonde hair and perfect nails. She had married Richard 4 years ago when Ethan was 13, and since then had assumed the role of lady of the house with a rigidity that bordered on cruelty. Victoria wasn't evil by nature, but was deeply insecure. She came from a middle-class family and had never fully adjusted to the luxurious life she now led. This made her act exaggeratedly, constantly trying to prove she deserved to be there. In her mind, Ethan represented a constant threat. He was the living memory of Isabella, Richard's first wife, who had died when Ethan was just 2 years old. Isabella had been Richard's great love, and though he never said it openly, Victoria felt she was competing with the memory of a woman she couldn't defeat. Thus, every affectionate gesture Richard made towards his son was interpreted by Victoria as a diminishing of his love for her. And Ethan, sensitive and perceptive, noticed this tension, even without fully understanding its origins. The house, which should have been a home, had become a silent battlefield where every glance, every word, every gesture was measured and weighed, and in the midst of it all was a 17-year-old boy who just wanted to feel loved and accepted. It was in this context that Mrs. Lucy's gesture gained an even greater dimension. In an environment where Ethan was accustomed to being treated as a problem to be solved, or a piece in an emotional chess game, having someone simply defend him was revolutionary. Thursday afternoon had begun like any other at Hopewood Estate. Ethan had finished his studies early and decided to go downstairs to get a book from the library. He was rereading The Little Prince, one of the few books that had belonged to his mother and which he treasured. He descended the marble stairs with the book in his hands, absorbed in a passage about baobabs and distant planets. When he reached the main hall, he saw Victoria talking on the phone with a friend, gesturing animatedly as she discussed the charity gala they were organizing. Ethan, as he always did, waved discreetly in her direction and murmured a polite "hi," not wanting to interrupt her conversation. It was exactly what any well-mannered young man would do, greet without being intrusive. But Victoria, who had spent the entire morning arguing with the party decorator and was particularly irritated, interpreted the gesture as disrespect. "Excuse me, Martha, I'll call you back later," she said into the phone, hanging up with an abrupt motion. "Ethan!" Her voice echoed through the hall with an intensity that made the young man stop immediately. "You come back here now." Ethan felt his stomach clench. He turned slowly, the book still in his hands, trying to understand what he had done wrong. "Did something happen, Victoria? Did something happen?" she repeated, her voice rising an octave. "You greeted me as if I were, I don't know, a stranger in my own house." "I did greet you." Ethan tried to keep his voice calm, but his hands began to tremble slightly. "I said, hi. I said, hi." Victoria walked towards him, her high heels echoing on the marble. "I am your stepmother, Ethan. I deserve respect in this house. When you enter a room where I am, you stop, look me in the eye, and say, 'Good afternoon, Victoria. How are you?' as a polite person would." Her tone was growing louder, and Ethan felt his cheeks burning with shame. He looked around, noticing that Martha, the housekeeper, had stopped on the second floor and was pretending to clean the banister while watching everything. The gardener outside had also paused his work. "Sorry," Ethan mumbled, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't mean to disrespect you. Didn't mean to." Victoria was now inches from him, her index finger pointed at his face. "You always do this. You always treat me as if I'm invisible. Do you think that just because I'm not your biological mother, you can ignore me?" Ethan felt his eyes sting. That was an ever-open wound, the mention of his mother, the implicit comparison, the constant reminder that he was different, that he didn't quite fit into this reformed family. I don't think that way," he managed to say, but his voice was failing. "You don't think that way?" Victoria laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "Ethan, you're 17, not a child. You need to learn that in this house there's hierarchy, there's respect. Your father works day and night to maintain all this." She gestured around, encompassing the luxury that surrounded them. "And you can't even have the decency to greet me properly." The book slipped from Ethan's hands and fell to the floor with a dull thud that echoed through the hall. He quickly bent down to pick it up, trying to hide the tears that were starting to form in his eyes. "Look at me when I'm speaking." Victoria's voice was now at what she considered her maximum tone of authority. "Do you think you can ignore me just because I'm your stepmother? I am the lady of this house. I deserve respect." It was at that moment that Mrs. Lucy appeared at the hall entrance, carrying the afternoon tea tray. She had heard the shouting from the kitchen and had come to see what was happening. When she saw Ethan, that boy she had known since he was little, who had always been polite and respectful, with his head bowed, trembling with nervousness, something inside her rebelled. Mrs. Lucy had a limit, and seeing a child, because to her Ethan was still that, a child, being publicly humiliated over a ridiculous misunderstanding was that limit. The tea tray trembled in her hands as she took 3 determined steps towards the center of the hall. Her voice, normally soft and respectful, was clear and firm. "Excuse me, Mrs. Victoria, but Ethan was just engrossed in his book. He has always been polite. You know that." The silence that followed was as if time had stopped in Hopewood Estate. Victoria turned slowly to Mrs. Lucy, her eyes wide with shock. Ethan looked up, equally surprised, watching that simple woman who had just done the unthinkable. "What did you say?" Victoria's voice came out as a hiss. Mrs. Lucy took a deep breath. Her 15 years of service in that house, her impeccable reputation, her financial stability, everything was at risk at that moment. But when she looked at Ethan, she saw something that made her continue. Gratitude mixed with astonishment, as if he couldn't believe someone had taken his side. "Ethan is a good boy, Mrs. Victoria. He greeted you, yes. I heard him from the kitchen. He was just reading, concentrated. It wasn't intentional." Victoria was speechless for a moment. In 4 years of marriage, no employee had ever questioned her authority. And now, just when she was trying to establish her position as lady of the house, a maid was contradicting her in front of her stepson. "Mrs. Lucy," she said, trying to regain her composure, "I think you're forgetting your place in this house." It was then that a key was heard in the front door. Richard Montgomery was arriving early from work. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more terrible, depending on one's point of view. Richard entered the hall, just as Victoria said those words, when Ethan's eyes were red, holding the book, when Mrs. Lucy still maintained her protective stance beside the young man. "What's going on here?" Richard's voice echoed through the room, and everyone present turned to him. Richard Montgomery was an intelligent and observant man. In a few seconds, he was able to read the scene. His son, clearly distraught, his wife, visibly agitated, and Mrs. Lucy, the most discreet and respectful employee he had ever had, in a position that clearly indicated something exceptional had happened. "Richard," Victoria was the first to speak, trying to take control of the narrative, "you arrived at the right time. I was trying to teach Ethan some manners, and Mrs. Lucy thought she could interfere." But Richard knew all the people involved in that scene well. He knew Victoria's explosive nature when she felt threatened. He knew Ethan's heightened sensitivity and, most importantly, he knew Mrs. Lucy's unwavering character. If Mrs. Lucy had taken such a stand, there was a very serious reason. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer, "are you okay?" Ethan looked at his father, then at Mrs. Lucy, then at Victoria. For a moment, he wanted to minimize the situation, to say everything was fine, as he always did. But Mrs. Lucy's courageous gesture had touched him deeply. "I just said hi to Victoria when I came down," he said, his voice still trembling. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone." Richard looked at his wife, then at Mrs. Lucy. "And you, Mrs. Lucy, what happened?" Mrs. Lucy hesitated. She knew anything she said could be interpreted as criticism of Victoria, and that could cost her job. But when she looked at Ethan, she saw something in him that made her speak the truth. "Mr. Richard?" Ethan came down reading his book, greeted Mrs. Victoria politely, and well, there was a misunderstanding. Her words were careful, respectful, but Richard caught the implicit message, and more importantly, he saw something in Mrs. Lucy's eyes that deeply intrigued him. It wasn't just the concern of an employee for an employer. It was something deeper, more personal, as if she were protecting not just Ethan, but something larger that Richard still couldn't comprehend. At that moment, observing the scene in the mansion's hall, Richard Montgomery had a strange feeling, as if he was missing something important, as if there was a piece of his own family's puzzle that he hadn't yet found. And that feeling would begin to change everything. In the days following the incident in the hall, the atmosphere at Hopewood Estate changed in an almost imperceptible, yet definitive way. It was as if a stone had been thrown into a calm lake, and the ripples, though small, continued to spread. Victoria no longer mentioned the incident, but her behavior towards Mrs. Lucy became even more formal and distant. She began to give instructions more rigidly, scrutinizing the maid's work with hawk-like eyes, looking for any reason to criticize. Ethan, in turn, found himself observing Mrs. Lucy in a completely new way. She was no longer just the kind employee who prepared his breakfast or discreetly asked about his studies. She was the woman who had risked her job to defend him, and this sparked in him a curiosity he had never felt before. He began to notice small details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way Mrs. Lucy always knew exactly how he liked his meals, even without him having specifically mentioned his preferences. The way she sometimes looked at him. It wasn't just professional affection. There was something deeper, more personal. And there was also that song. Ethan had sometimes noticed Mrs. Lucy singing softly while she worked. It was a gentle, melancholic song that she murmured especially when she was alone in the kitchen in the morning. The melody was familiar. It awakened a strange sensation in him, as if it were a memory on the tip of his tongue but refusing to surface. On a Friday afternoon, while studying in the garden near the oak tree, Ethan heard Mrs. Lucy humming again. This time, she was hanging clothes on the line at the back of the service area and didn't notice he was nearby. "Sleep, my boy. The night is coming. The guardian angel also comes to see you. Sleep, for life is a long train that will take you wherever you may go." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. That song. He knew that song, but from where? When? He closed the history book he was reading and walked slowly towards the service area. Mrs. Lucy, focused on her work, continued to sing. "Mrs. Lucy," he said softly, trying not to startle her. She turned quickly, and Ethan could have sworn he saw a flash of something, surprise, fear, pass through her eyes before she smiled with her usual kindness. "Oh, Ethan, sorry, was I singing too loud? Sometimes I don't even notice." No, he hastened to say. "That song, and where is it from? I have the impression I've heard it before." Mrs. Lucy hesitated for a moment, her hands stopping as she folded the sheet she held. "Oh, it's an old lullaby, my boy. My mother used to sing it when I was little." "Is that all?" Ethan insisted, unable to explain why that song affected him so much. Mrs. Lucy looked at him with an expression Ethan couldn't fully decipher. There was affection there, but also a deep sadness, as if she was fighting a painful memory. "Sometimes old songs just hang in the air, don't they?" she said finally, trying to sound casual. "They pass from person to person, from family to family." But Ethan noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she resumed folding the clothes. That night, alone in his room, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the interrupted conversation. There was something in Mrs. Lucy's reaction that didn't fit, and the more he thought about it, the more strange details began to make sense. Why did Mrs. Lucy know he didn't like onions in his food if he had never mentioned it? Why did she always put a little more sugar in his milk, exactly the amount he preferred? Why did she always know when he was feeling sad, even when he tried to hide it? And why, on that terrible afternoon in the hall, had she risked so much to defend him? Ethan got out of bed and went to the window overlooking the garden. There was the oak tree, lit by the soft light of the crescent moon. How many hours had he spent there, sitting on the stone bench, reading or just thinking? And how many times had Mrs. Lucy appeared with some excuse or another to bring a glass of juice, to ask if he wasn't cold, always at the right moment, always when he most needed company? It couldn't just be a coincidence. On Saturday morning, Ethan went downstairs earlier than usual. He found Mrs. Lucy in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the same dedication as always. But this time, he paid attention to every movement. The way she separated the bread, choosing the two most toasted pieces, how she checked the milk's temperature before pouring it into his cup, how she cut the fruit into small pieces, exactly the way he could eat without making a sound. "Mrs. Lucy," he said, sitting at the kitchen table instead of taking his coffee to the garden, as he usually did. "Yes, my boy. You've worked here a long time, haven't you?" 15 years next month," she replied, placing his plate in front of him. "And you knew my mother?" The question slipped out before Ethan could think better, and Mrs. Lucy's reaction was immediate and revealing. She stopped completely what she was doing. Her hands gripped the edge of the sink, and for a moment, just for a moment, Ethan saw tears form in her eyes. "I knew your mother, yes," she said finally, her voice lower than normal. "Mrs. Isabella was a very special person." "What was she like?" Ethan asked, leaning forward. It was rare for anyone to talk about his mother, and when it happened, the descriptions were always vague and polished. Mrs. Lucy turned slowly to look at him, and Ethan saw something extraordinary happen. For a few seconds, her face lit up with genuine joy, as if she were seeing not Ethan, but someone he couldn't identify. "She had a smile that lit up any room," Mrs. Lucy said. Her voice filled with an emotion that went far beyond a simple professional memory, and she sang. Oh, how beautifully she sang. She had a soft voice that calmed any troubled heart. "What songs did she sing?" Mrs. Lucy hesitated, and Ethan realized he was close to something important. "And the lullabies mostly. She really liked to sing for—" Her voice trailed off, and she had to turn back to the sink. "For whom?" Ethan gently insisted. "For you, my boy. She sang for you." The revelation hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. You were here when I was a baby." Mrs. Lucy closed her eyes for a moment, as if making a very important decision. When she opened them again, Ethan saw a determination in them he had never noticed before. "Ethan," she said, approaching the table and sitting in the chair beside him, "there are things about your story, about your family, that perhaps you don't know, things that—" The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Richard's footsteps coming down the stairs. Mrs. Lucy immediately stood up and returned to her position beside the sink, resuming her professional demeanor. "Good morning, Mr. Richard," she said, her voice back to her working tone. "Coffee is ready." Richard entered the kitchen with his usual morning haste, greeted both of them, and picked up his cup of coffee. But Ethan noticed his father observing the scene with curiosity. It was unusual to find his son in the kitchen at that hour, talking with Mrs. Lucy. "What were you two talking about?" Richard asked, trying to sound casual. Ethan looked at Mrs. Lucy, who avoided his gaze. "About my mother." Richard stopped with his cup halfway to his mouth. "Ah." The awkwardness in the air was palpable. Ethan realized he had touched on a sensitive subject, but didn't understand exactly why. "Your father has to go to work, my boy," Mrs. Lucy said softly, trying to change the subject. "And don't you have English class this morning?" Ethan nodded, but as he rose from the table, he whispered, "We'll finish this conversation later." Mrs. Lucy looked at him with an expression that mixed affection and concern. "Of course, my boy." But Richard had heard the whisper, and as he walked to the car, a strange feeling began to overcome him. For years, he hadn't actively thought about Isabella, not because he no longer loved her, but because the pain of loss had turned into a closed compartment in his mind. Now, suddenly, his son was asking questions, and Mrs. Lucy. There was something in the way she spoke about Isabella that was different, more personal, as if there were memories there she had never shared. That afternoon, Ethan couldn't concentrate on his English class. His mind kept returning to the interrupted conversation with Mrs. Lucy. There was something in her words, in the way her eyes filled with tears when speaking of his mother, that indicated a much deeper connection than he had imagined. When he got home, he looked for Mrs. Lucy but discovered she had left early, something that never happened. Victoria informed him, with a slightly satisfied tone, that Mrs. Lucy had asked for time off to deal with personal matters. "Very strange," Victoria commented, filing her nails in the living room. "In the 4 years I've been here, I've never seen her miss work or leave early. Something must be going on." Ethan went up to his room but couldn't stop thinking. There was a missing piece to the puzzle, and the more he tried to fit it, the more confused he became. It was then that he remembered the attic. Hopewood Estate had a large attic where Richard stored old documents, furniture from the house's original decor, and some things that had belonged to Isabella. Ethan knew of the place's existence, but had never gone up there. Partly out of respect for his father, partly because going through his mother's things had always seemed too painful, but now, for the first time, he felt he needed to understand his own story. The attic was accessed by a retractable ladder at the end of the second-floor hallway. Ethan waited until he heard Richard arrive home from work and lock himself in his office for his evening calls, and until he was sure Victoria was watching her shows in her room. He carefully climbed the ladder, turning on the light. The attic was more organized than he expected. There were several boxes labeled in his father's meticulous handwriting: Company Documents 2015, Old Decor, University Books. And then he saw it. Isabella, personal belongings. Ethan's heart pounded. With trembling hands, he opened the box. Inside were simple pieces of jewelry, some clothes stored in plastic bags for preservation, books with affectionate dedications from Richard, and photographs. Ethan picked up an envelope full of photos and began to leaf through them. His mother was truly beautiful, as everyone always said: wavy brown hair, a luminous smile, eyes full of life. He saw photos of her with Richard, still young, wedding photos, pregnancy photos. And then Ethan found something that made him stop breathing. It was a photograph of his mother in the hospital, still weak after childbirth, holding a baby, himself, in her lap. But that wasn't what shocked him. It was who was standing beside the bed. Mrs. Lucy, a Mrs. Lucy, 15 years younger, but unmistakably her, holding Isabella's hand and smiling at the camera with a familiarity that went far beyond an employer-employee relationship. Ethan turned the photo over. On the back, in his mother's delicate handwriting, was written, "Lucy, my sister by heart, and our little Ethan, March 2007. Sister by heart." Ethan felt the world spin around him. Mrs. Lucy wasn't just an employee of the house. She had been his mother's best friend. She had been present at his birth, and all these years, all these 15 years, she had taken care of him not just as a dedicated employee, but as someone who had deeply loved his mother. He continued leafing through the photos with increasing urgency. There were several images of Mrs. Lucy with Isabella, the two in the mansion's garden, the two preparing what seemed to be the baby's room, the two smiling while assembling a crib. And there was a photo that broke Ethan's heart. His mother, visibly ill, lying in her hospital bed, with baby Ethan in her arms while Mrs. Lucy held her hand. On the back, the same delicate handwriting: Lucy, promised to take care of our boy, May 2008. May 2008. His mother had died in June 2008. Ethan finally understood what he had witnessed all these years. Mrs. Lucy wasn't just working in the Montgomery family home. She was fulfilling a promise made to her best friend on her deathbed to take care of Ethan as if he were her own son. Every breakfast prepared with affection, every concern for his well-being, every moment she appeared when he most needed company, all of it wasn't just professionalism, it was love. It was the way she had found to honor Isabella's memory and to continue caring for the child her friend had left behind, and the song, the lullaby he had recognized. Ethan closed his eyes and tried to remember. There was a soft voice singing to him when he was very little, in moments when he woke up crying in the middle of the night. He had always believed they were memories of his mother, But now he realized they might have been memories of Mrs. Lucy, who had probably taken over nighttime care when Isabella became too ill to do so. Tears began to stream down Ethan's face. Tears of sadness for the loss he had never fully understood, but also tears of immense gratitude for having had someone all these years who had loved him unconditionally, someone who had risked her own job to defend him, someone who had kept a promise of love for 15 years in silence, never asking for recognition. Ethan carefully put the photos back in the envelope, but he took one with him, the hospital photo, where Isabella held his hand and Mrs. Lucy held his mother's. He needed to talk to her. He needed to thank her. He needed to understand why she had kept the secret for so long. But when he came down from the attic, he discovered that Mrs. Lucy hadn't shown up on Sunday. Richard mentioned, worried, that she had called, saying she was having health problems and would need a few days off. "It's very strange," Richard said during Sunday lunch. "In 15 years, Mrs. Lucy has never been sick. I hope it's nothing serious." Ethan realized Mrs. Lucy's sudden absence wasn't a coincidence. She was pulling away because she knew he was starting to ask the right questions and perhaps feared the consequences of revealing the truth. That night, alone in his room, Ethan looked at the picture. 3 people who loved each other, his mother, himself as a baby, and the woman who had dedicated 15 years of her life to honor a promise of love. But what Ethan would discover next would change everything, because the story of Mrs. Lucy and his family was even deeper than he imagined. The next 3 days passed like an eternity for Ethan. Mrs. Lucy remained absent, and the house felt strangely empty without her silent but constant presence. Richard had tried to contact her by phone a few times, but she always said she was getting better and would return soon. Victoria, on the other hand, seemed satisfied with the situation. "Perhaps it's an opportunity to find someone more suitable," she commented during Tuesday dinner. Someone who better understands the boundaries between employers and employees." Ethan felt a wave of anger, but controlled himself. He needed to talk to Mrs. Lucy before Victoria could convince his father to replace her. "If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, and you want to be part of our community, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss how Ethan uncovers the full truth and fights for what's right." On Wednesday morning, Ethan made a decision. He took the bicycle he rarely used and rode to the neighborhood where he knew Mrs. Lucy lived. He had seen the address once on a piece of her mail that had mistakenly arrived at the mansion. The neighborhood was simple, with small, well-kept houses, paved but narrow streets, very different from the opulence Ethan was accustomed to. He found the street without difficulty, but when he reached the number he was looking for, he hesitated. Mrs. Lucy's house was a modest 2-story building, painted light blue, with a small garden in front where roses and jasmines grew. There was something welcoming about that place, something that reminded him of the affection she always showed in her work. Ethan took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The door was opened by a woman he didn't know, younger than Mrs. Lucy, perhaps in her 40s, with features that vaguely resembled hers. "Hi," Ethan said, suddenly nervous. "Oh, I'm Ethan Montgomery. I'm looking for Mrs. Lucy." The woman's eyes widened. "Ethan!" She looked him up and down as if seeing a ghost. "My goodness, you're just like whom?" Ethan asked, intrigued. Before the woman could answer, Mrs. Lucy's voice was heard from inside the house. "Who is Martha?" "Mom!" the woman shouted back. It's Ethan Montgomery." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan heard hurried footsteps, and then Mrs. Lucy appeared at the door. She was wearing casual clothes, jeans and a simple blouse, without the apron she always wore at the mansion. For a moment, she seemed like a completely different person, younger, more relaxed, but also visibly disturbed to see him. "Ethan," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Now, please." Mrs. Lucy looked at her daughter, then back at Ethan. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire to protect him versus the fear of the consequences of a conversation she knew was inevitable. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside to let him pass. The house inside was even more welcoming than outside. The living room was small, but well decorated, with simple but comfortable furniture, many plants, and family photographs scattered on the walls. Ethan immediately noticed that some of the photos showed a happy family, a younger Mrs. Lucy, a man who was probably her late husband, and 2 children, the woman who had opened the door, and a boy who seemed a few years younger. "Sit down, my boy," Mrs. Lucy said, indicating the sofa. "Martha, please make some juice for Ethan." Martha hesitated. "Mom, are you sure that—" "Martha!" Mrs. Lucy's voice had a firmness Ethan rarely heard. With the juice, when they were alone, Mrs. Lucy sat in the armchair opposite the sofa and looked at Ethan with an expression that mixed affection and concern. "How did you find out where I live?" "I saw your address once," Ethan said. "But that's not what matters. Mrs. Lucy, I found a photo." He took the hospital photograph from his pocket and placed it on the coffee table. Mrs. Lucy looked at the image, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. "Bruce, where did you find this?" "In the attic, in my mother's things." Ethan leaned forward. "Mrs. Lucy, why did you never tell me you knew my mother? Why did you never tell me you were friends?" Mrs. Lucy picked up the photograph with trembling hands. For a long moment, she just looked at the image, as if reliving that moment. "Your mother," she began, her voice choked with emotion. "Your mother was the most special person I've ever known in my life." "How did you two meet?" Mrs. Lucy took a deep breath, as if preparing to tell a story she had kept for years. "I was working for a family here in the neighborhood, a good family, but they were going through financial difficulties. One day I received an offer to work at the mansion of a successful businessman, your father. That was 2004. You weren't even born yet." Ethan heard Martha returning with the juice, but motioned for her not to interrupt. "When I arrived at the mansion, your mother was there. She had just married your father and was trying to adapt to that luxurious life, but she wasn't like the other rich women I had known." "How so?" "She actually talked to me, asked about my family, about my children. When she found out my Martha was having trouble in school, she offered to pay for tutoring. When my husband lost his job, she talked to your father, and he got him a job at the company." Mrs. Lucy paused, wiping away the tears streaming down her face. She was kind, Ethan, genuinely kind, and she was so lonely in that big house. Lonely. Your father worked a lot, always worked a lot. And your mother, she came from a simple family like mine. All the friends she had made were from her single days, and now she was living in a completely different world. I think that's why we connected so much." Ethan began to understand. "You became friends, more than friends, sisters." Mrs. Lucy smiled through her tears. "I took care of the house, but she took care of me too. When my husband got sick, she was the one who insisted I take him to the best doctors. When my Martha graduated from high school, she was the one who paid for the graduation party. And when you were born—" "Oh, Ethan," Mrs. Lucy's face lit up. "When you were born, it was the happiest day I ever saw your mother. She was so anxious, so nervous, but so happy too. She asked me to be there at the hospital, said she wanted the people she loved most to be present." Ethan looked at the photograph again, and then Mrs. Lucy's expression darkened. "Then your mother started to get sick. At first, it was just tiredness, a weakness she said was normal after childbirth, but it got worse. What she had, a very severe infection that affected several organs. The doctors did everything, but Mrs. Lucy couldn't finish the sentence. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. That's when she asked you to take care of me. Mrs. Lucy nodded. The last time we talked at the hospital, she held my hand and said, "Lucy, promise you'll take care of my boy. Promise you'll be close to him, that you'll protect him." I promised, Ethan. I promised your mother you would never be alone. Tears now streamed freely down Ethan's face. He finally understood why Mrs. Lucy had risked so much to defend him in the mansion's hall, why she always knew exactly what he needed, why her gaze always had that special affection. "All these years," he said, his voice choked, "you've been taking care of me because of the promise to my mother." "No," Mrs. Lucy said firmly, standing up and coming to sit beside him on the sofa. "Ethan, I started taking care of you because of the promise to your mother, but I continued taking care of you because you became part of my family, because I love you as if you were my own son." Ethan couldn't hold back anymore. He hugged Mrs. Lucy, and for a few minutes they just cried together. He, for the discovery of a love that had always been there. She, for the relief of finally being able to express feelings she had kept for 15 years. When they separated, Ethan had a question he needed to ask. "Why did you never tell my father? Why did you keep it a secret?" Mrs. Lucy sighed. "Your father. He suffered a lot when your mother died. Ethan. A lot. And he deals with pain by keeping memories in a closed place in his heart. Talking about Isabella, about our friendship, would force him to open wounds he prefers to keep closed. And Victoria. Victoria is afraid of your mother's memory. She's afraid you'll discover that no one will ever fill the place Isabella held in your father's heart. If she knew I was your mother's friend, that I'm here because of her, it would be even harder." Ethan understood Mrs. Lucy's dilemma. She had spent 15 years balancing on an emotional tightrope, fulfilling a promise made to her best friend, caring for her child as if he were her own, but without being able to reveal the depth of that love, for fear of hurting the people involved. "Mrs. Lucy," he said, holding her hands, "you don't have to carry this weight alone anymore. I want my father to know. I want him to understand what you've done for our family." Mrs. Lucy shook her head. "Ethan, it's not that simple." "But it is," he insisted. "You gave me something I didn't know I was missing, the certainty that I am loved. And my father needs to know that too." At that moment, Martha entered the room. Ethan realized she had been listening to the conversation from the hallway. "Mom," she said softly, "maybe it really is time to tell the truth." Mrs. Lucy looked at her daughter, then at Ethan. "You don't know how Victoria might react. She has a lot of influence over your father." "Then we'll find out," Ethan said with a determination that surprised even himself. "But first, you come home. Come back to our home, where you've always belonged." Mrs. Lucy smiled through her tears. "Are you sure, my boy?" "I am. And it's not just me who needs you. My father needs you too. He just doesn't know it yet." That afternoon, when Ethan returned to Hopewood Estate, he felt like a different person. He was no longer the lonely, insecure young man who had left home that morning. Now he knew he had always been loved, that he had never truly been alone, and he was determined to fight for this family he had discovered he had. A family that included an extraordinary woman who had dedicated half her life to honoring a promise of love. But what he didn't yet know was that his decision to bring the truth to light would unleash a series of events that would transform not only his relationship with Mrs. Lucy, but the entire dynamic of Hopewood Estate. Mrs. Lucy returned to work on Thursday morning, but Ethan immediately noticed that something had changed in the house's dynamic. Victoria was more vigilant, observing the maid's every move with hawk-like eyes, as if looking for reasons to criticize. "Mrs. Lucy," Victoria said during breakfast with an excessively formal tone, "I've noticed you've been talking quite a bit with Ethan lately. I think it's important to remember that there are professional boundaries that must be respected." Ethan saw Mrs. Lucy stiffen slightly, but she merely nodded respectfully. "Of course, Mrs. Victoria." "Excellent," Victoria smiled, but it was a cold smile. "I would also like you to start wearing a proper uniform. I'll arrange some dresses that I consider more appropriate for an employee of this house." Ethan felt a wave of indignation. In 15 years, Mrs. Lucy had always dressed simply but neatly, and there had never been issues with her appearance. It was obvious that Victoria was trying to establish a stricter hierarchy to make everyone's place clear. "Victoria," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm, "Mrs. Lucy has always dressed appropriately. I don't see any need for—" "Ethan," Victoria interrupted him, "these are household management decisions. You are too young to understand certain nuances." At that moment, Richard entered the kitchen to get his coffee. Ethan seized the opportunity. "Dad, can we talk later? There's something important I want to tell you." Richard looked at his son with curiosity. There was something different about Ethan, a determination he rarely showed. "Of course, son. How about we talk in my office when I get home from work?" Ethan nodded, but noticed the suspicious look Victoria exchanged with Richard. It was as if she already knew this conversation represented a threat to the balance she had established in the house. During the day, Ethan observed Victoria implementing small changes designed to make Mrs. Lucy's work more difficult. She rearranged some furniture in the living room, making cleaning harder. She invited friends for afternoon tea, creating extra work. She requested last-minute changes to the dinner menu. Mrs. Lucy endured everything in silence, but Ethan saw the fatigue accumulating in her eyes. The worst moment came during the afternoon, when Ethan was studying in the garden and heard raised voices coming from the kitchen. He approached discreetly and overheard Victoria reprimanding Mrs. Lucy for something seemingly trivial. "This dish towel has a small stain, Mrs. Lucy. In my mother's house, that would be unacceptable. I hope you understand that the standard in this house is very high." Ethan entered the kitchen, determined to defend Mrs. Lucy once more. But she gave him a discreet signal with her eyes, asking him not to get involved. He understood. She didn't want him to risk his relationship with Victoria because of her. But Ethan was learning that sometimes loving someone means accepting a fight for that person, even when they ask you not to. At 7 p.m., Richard arrived home from work and found Ethan waiting in the office. The atmosphere was formal, with a large, dark wooden desk, shelves full of business books, and walls decorated with Richard's diplomas and professional awards. "So, son, what did you want to talk about?" Ethan took a deep breath. He had mentally rehearsed that conversation several times during the day, but now, before his father, he felt nervous. "Dad, it's about Mrs. Lucy and about my mother." Richard stiffened immediately. Ethan could see that mentioning Isabella was still painful for him, even after so many years. "Ethan, I know you're curious about your mother, but, Dad, please, let me speak." Ethan took the hospital photograph from his pocket. "I found this in the attic." Richard took the photo, and his face instantly paled. For a long moment, he just stared at the image, and Ethan could see a storm of emotions passing through his eyes. "Where did you find this?" "In my mother's things. Dad, Mrs. Lucy, was Mom's best friend. She was there when I was born, and she promised Mom she would take care of me." Richard continued to look at the photograph, as if seeing that moment for the first time, despite having been present. "All these years," Ethan continued, "Mrs. Lucy wasn't just working here, she was fulfilling a promise. She loved me all these years because of the love she had for my mother." "Why did she never tell me this?" Richard's voice came out as a whisper. Because she knew it would be painful for you to remember. Because she wanted to respect the way you cope with Mom's loss. Richard stood up and walked to the window overlooking the garden. Ethan could see he was struggling with memories he had kept locked away for years. "Your mother really loved Mrs. Lucy," he said finally. "They became very close. Isabella always said Lucy was like a sister to her." "Then why did you never talk about it?" Richard turned to his son. "Because when your mother died, I couldn't deal with anything that reminded me of her. It was easier to treat Mrs. Lucy just as an employee than as the person who had been my wife's best friend." Ethan felt a mixture of sadness and compassion for his father. "But, Dad, that's not fair to Mrs. Lucy. She gave up revealing the love she felt for our family to protect your feelings." "I know." Richard sat back down, running his hands over his face. "I always knew there was something special about the way she took care of you. I always knew it went beyond professionalism." "And now? What do we do with this information?" Richard remained silent for a long moment. "Ethan, things aren't that simple. Victoria, she's already insecure about your mother's memory. If she finds out Mrs. Lucy was Isabella's best friend, that she's here because of her dad, that can't be a reason to keep lying." "It's not lying, son. It's keeping the peace in the family." Ethan leaned forward. "What family, Dad? A family where people have to hide who they really are. A family where Victoria can humiliate Mrs. Lucy because she doesn't know how much she sacrificed for us." Richard looked at his son with surprise. There was a maturity in his words that he didn't expect. "What are you suggesting? That we tell Victoria? Tell everyone? Mrs. Lucy deserves to be recognized for who she really is. Not just an employee, but a person who loves our family and has made sacrifices for us for 15 years. Ethan, you don't understand the implications of this. Victoria might not take it well. And if she doesn't, Dad, Mrs. Lucy risked her job to defend me when Victoria was humiliating me. She put my well-being above her own safety. It's not fair that she continues to be treated as just any employee when she is, in fact, part of our family." Richard looked at the photograph again. "Do you really believe we should tell everything?" "I do. And more than that, Dad, I think Mom would want us to do this. I think she would be sad to know that her best friend spent 15 years hiding the love she feels for us." It was then that they heard footsteps in the hallway. The office door was slightly ajar, and Ethan had the terrible feeling that someone had been listening to the conversation. Richard must have had the same feeling because he immediately went to the door and opened it completely. The hallway was empty, but there was something in the air, a familiar perfume, the sound of heels quickly retreating. "Victoria," Richard murmured, more to himself than to Ethan. And they were right. Upstairs, Victoria was in her room, her heart pounding, processing everything she had heard. The revelation that Mrs. Lucy had been Isabella's best friend was not just shocking, it was terrifying to her. The next morning, the tension at Hopewood Estate was palpable. Victoria came down for breakfast with a forced smile, but Ethan could see the storm behind her carefully made-up eyes. "Unkid, good morning, family," she said, her excessively cheerful tone sounding false in the room. Mrs. Lucy was preparing coffee as usual, but Ethan noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she served the cups. She also sensed that something had changed. "Mrs. Lucy," Victoria said suddenly, "I think today would be a good day for you to completely clean the attic. It must be full of unnecessary things up there." Ethan and Richard exchanged a meaningful glance. It was obvious that Victoria wanted Mrs. Lucy to find the photos and other belongings of Isabella, perhaps hoping to create an emotional confrontation. "Excuse me, Mrs. Victoria," Mrs. Lucy replied respectfully, "but the attic was organized by Mr. Richard. Perhaps it would be better for him to decide what should be done with the items there." "I am the lady of this house," Victoria replied, her voice growing sharper. And I am asking you to clean the attic." It was then that Richard stood up from the table. "Victoria, can we talk in my office now?" His tone allowed no argument. Victoria hesitated, but followed her husband, leaving Ethan alone with Mrs. Lucy. "She knows," Ethan said as soon as they were alone. "I know, my boy." Mrs. Lucy sighed, sitting in the chair beside him. "I heard you talking last night, didn't I?" Ethan nodded. "And Dip, what are we going to do?" "Maybe it's time for me to look for another job," Mrs. Lucy said sadly. "I don't want to cause problems for your family." "No!" Ethan stood up abruptly. "Mrs. Lucy, don't you understand? You are part of our family, and I'm not going to let Victoria take that away from us." In the office, a tense conversation was taking place. "You knew?" Victoria asked as soon as the door closed. "You knew she was Isabella's friend and never told me," Richard sighed. "I suspected, but—" "Suspected?" Victoria laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "Richard, this woman has lived in our house for 15 years as a kind of living memorial to your first wife. And you didn't think it was important to tell me. Victoria, it's not that simple. It's not simple." She began to pace back and forth. "Richard, I spent 4 years trying to build a family with you and Ethan, trying to find my place in this house. And all the time, there was a person here who represented everything I could never be or have." Richard could see the genuine pain in his wife's eyes. For a moment, he understood her perspective, how difficult it must have been to compete with the memory of a woman she had never met, especially with someone in the house who had loved Isabella deeply. "And what do you want me to do?" he asked softly. "I want you to choose," Victoria said, stopping her pacing and facing him directly. "Either she leaves this house or I leave." The ultimatum hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Richard felt the weight of the decision. On one side, his current wife and the stability of his marriage. On the other, a woman who had dedicated 15 years of her life to caring for his son out of love for Isabella's memory. Meanwhile, in the garden, Ethan had decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He knew where Mrs. Lucy kept some of her personal belongings, a small drawer in the kitchen pantry where she left some items during the workday. Inside the drawer, besides her mother's rosary, Ethan found something that made him smile. A small notebook with handwritten recipes. These weren't just ordinary recipes. They were special recipes, with notes about each family member's preferences. Ethan's breakfast: well-toasted bread, strawberry jam, never grape, warm milk with 2 spoons of sugar, soup for when Ethan has a cold, chicken noodle with plenty of broth, carrots in small pieces, a pinch of saffron. Remember, he doesn't like onions. Special birthday cake, Mrs. Isabella's recipe that she made when Richard was her boyfriend. He always gets emotional, but never says anything. Page after page of meticulous care, attention to detail, love translated into small daily gestures. And on the last page of the notebook, Ethan found something that made him cry. A letter written in Mrs. Lucy's careful handwriting. "My dear Isabella, if you can hear me from where you are, I want you to know that I kept my promise. Your Ethan grew up strong and handsome. He has your curious eyes and your kind heart. Sometimes I see you in him, especially when he truly smiles. I took care of him as I promised I would. I loved him as if he were my own son. I hope you are proud. He is a special boy, Isabella. You did a good job in the time you had with him. With all my love and longing, Lucy." Ethan closed the notebook and hugged it against his chest. This was the proof he needed, not to convince others, but for himself. Mrs. Lucy had not only kept a promise, she had loved truly and deeply all these years. That afternoon, Ethan made the bravest decision of his life. He waited until dinner time, when the whole family would be gathered, including Mrs. Lucy serving the meal. "Dad, Victoria," he said, standing up at the dinner table, "I need to say something." Richard and Victoria looked at him in surprise. Mrs. Lucy, who was clearing the appetizer plates, stopped where she was. "Mrs. Lucy," Ethan said, turning to her, "please sit with us. What I have to say is about you too." "Ethan," Victoria began, but he interrupted her with a gesture. "For 17 years of my life, I thought I was alone. I thought I had a father who loved me but was always busy, a stepmother who tolerated me, and staff who were paid to take care of me." He looked at each person at the table. "But I discovered something that changed everything. I discovered I have a second mother, a person who loved me every day of my life, not because she was paid to, but because she promised my biological mother she would take care of me." Victoria turned pale, but Ethan continued. "Mrs. Lucy is not just an employee of this house. She was my mother's best friend. She was present when I was born. She held my mother's hand when she was dying and promised she would take care of me." Tears began to stream down Mrs. Lucy's eyes, but she didn't move. For 15 years, she kept that promise in silence. She loved me like a son, protected me, took care of me. All this while pretending to be just a maid, so as not to cause problems for our family. Ethan picked up the recipe notebook he had brought with him. "She has a notebook with all my preferences noted. She knows exactly how I like my food, what songs calm me when I'm sad, what books I prefer. She knows these things because she spent 17 years observing me, loving me, taking care of me." He turned to Victoria. "Victoria, I know this must be difficult for you. I know you're afraid of my mother's memory. But Mrs. Lucy is not a threat to our family. She is our family." Ethan's voice was growing firmer, more determined. "And if someone in this house has to choose between accepting this or leaving, that person shouldn't be Mrs. Lucy. It should be whoever cannot accept the love she has for us." The silence that followed was profound. Victoria looked at Richard, at Ethan, at Mrs. Lucy. Richard was watching his son with a mixture of pride and surprise. He had never seen Ethan so determined, so mature. It was Victoria who broke the silence. "You all decided this behind my back," she said, her voice trembling. "You've turned me into the villain of the story." "No one is a villain here," Richard said softly, "but Ethan is right. Mrs. Lucy has been part of this family longer than any of us realized." Victoria looked around the table, suddenly seeing herself isolated. For a moment, Ethan thought she would leave the room, pack her bags, and abandon the house. But then, something unexpected happened. Victoria began to cry. They weren't tears of anger or frustration, but tears of deep, old pain. "I just wanted a place in this family," she whispered. "I just wanted you to love me as you love her memory." It was Mrs. Lucy who stood up first. To everyone's surprise, she walked to Victoria and hesitantly placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Victoria," she said softly, "love is not something that ends when you share it. Loving Isabella's memory doesn't mean not loving you, and recognizing the place I have in this family doesn't diminish your place." Victoria looked at Mrs. Lucy through her tears. "How can you be kind to me after how I treated you?" "Because I learned from Isabella that holding grudges only hurts the one who holds them, and because, in the end, we both love the same people, Richard and Ethan." Richard stood up from the table and walked to where Mrs. Lucy was. For a long moment, he just looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "Lucy," he said, using her first name without the Mrs., "for the first time in years. Forgive me for being so blind for so long." "There's nothing to forgive, Mr. Richard." "Yes, there is." Richard took her hands in his. "You sacrificed 15 years of your life to care for my son, to honor my wife's memory, and I never properly acknowledged it." He turned to the family gathered around the table. "From today on, I want everyone to know Lucy is not an employee of this house. She's part of this family, and as such, she deserves the respect, affection, and recognition she should have always received. Ethan stood up and hugged Mrs. Lucy, who finally allowed her tears to fall freely. "Thank you," he whispered in her ear, "for everything, for all these years, for keeping the promise to my mother, for loving me even when I didn't know I was being loved." When they separated, Ethan turned to Victoria, who was still sitting at the table, observing the scene. "Victoria," he said, extending his hand to her, "do you want to be a part of this family for real? Not as someone who competes with my mother's memory, but as someone who adds something new and special to what already exists." Victoria hesitated for a moment, then took his hand and stood up. I'd like to try," she said, her voice still trembling, "but I don't know if I know how to do that." It was Mrs. Lucy who replied, "We'll learn together, Mrs. Victoria. A family isn't born ready. It's built day by day with patience and love." 6 months later, Hopewood Estate had transformed into something it had never been before, a true home. Ethan woke up every morning to the smell of coffee prepared by Mrs. Lucy, who was now affectionately called Aunt Lucy by the whole family. But breakfast was no longer a solitary meal. Victoria had started coming down earlier, and the three would chat about the day's plans, Ethan's studies, and the small joys and worries of daily life. The garden, once silent and empty, now echoed with laughter. Victoria had discovered she had a talent for gardening, and she and Aunt Lucy spent afternoons tending the flowers together, while Ethan studied on the bench near the oak tree, which had become not a place of solitude, but a family gathering spot. Richard came home earlier whenever possible. Dinners were no longer formal, tense meals, but moments of genuine sharing. He had started talking about Isabella naturally, sharing memories that helped Ethan get to know his mother better, and helped Victoria understand that she was not a competitor, but a successor in the love of that family. The piano once again sounded in the living room, but now Ethan played for pleasure, not obligation. Sometimes Victoria would hum along, discovering she also had a beautiful voice. And Aunt Lucy, when she thought no one was listening, would murmur the lullabies Isabella used to sing, no longer as a painful secret, but as a bridge between the past and the present. The biggest change, perhaps, had happened in Ethan himself. The shy, insecure young man had transformed into a confident young man who knew he was loved and was not afraid to show love in return. His grades at school improved. He made new friends, and for the first time in years, when someone asked about his family, he smiled genuinely. On a Sunday afternoon, as the whole family was gathered in the garden, Richard reading the newspaper, Victoria and Aunt Lucy planning the week's menu, Ethan studying, the young man looked around and felt immense gratitude. "Aunt Lucy," he said suddenly. "Yes, my boy. Thank you for teaching our family to be a real family." Aunt Lucy smiled, that warm smile that had warmed Ethan's heart for 17 years. "My boy, family isn't about blood or employment contracts. Family is about choosing to love day after day, even when it's difficult. It's about being present, about caring, about protecting those we love." She looked around the garden, seeing Richard wave at her affectionately, seeing Victoria genuinely smile, seeing Ethan grown and happy. "And sometimes," she continued, "the most beautiful family is the one we build with our hearts, not with documents." The lesson of the Montgomery family was simple yet powerful. That true love knows no social hierarchies, that the compassion of a simple person can transform entire destinies, and that a real family is built not with money or status, but with presence, care, and daily dedication. That sometimes the most important people in our lives are those who love in silence, who serve without asking for recognition, who protect without expecting reward, and that when we finally recognize this love and give it the value it deserves, our whole life transforms. If this story touched your heart and you want to be the first to watch our next emotional narratives, go ahead and subscribe right now. Every day, we bring you new, inspiring stories that remind us of the power of love and family. Don't miss out. Join our community.